So thank you, Sam, for coming in from abroad. I've got a bit of a bio to read out, and I'm just going to read it, Kate, because I want to try and get it right. So Sam first studied for a master's degree in physics with Australian study at the University of Exeter and the University of Wollongong in Australia. So aren't we all immensely lucky then that he moved into the biological realm? And he worked with Professor Daniel Robert on electrostatic ecology. So Sam completed his PhD in biological sciences at the University of Bristol in 2023, where he won the award for best PhD thesis in the faculty. So congratulations, Sam. It's a little late now, but congratulations. Sam is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Museum of Natural History in Berlin in Germany. And he is working with Dr. Lauren Sumner-Rooney on the eyes and other senses of spiders. And what I haven't yet told Sam is that I am immensely jealous of this project, because I know Lauren and she's fantastic and the research she does is fantastic. And if I could do a project, I probably want to do the one that you're doing right now. This is, you know, amazing. Anyway, so I'll hand over to Sam in just a moment. But just before we start, I'm going to encourage you, everyone, once again, do drop any questions that you might have for Sam into the chat. Like I say, we've got Gavin on standby to help with questions. I'm going to be keeping an eye on things as we go through as well. And then we'll try and put as many of them as we can to Sam at the end of the session. So now, though, without further ado, it's over to you, Sam.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you also, everyone, for tuning in this evening. It's really nice for you to be here in your free time. I really, really appreciate that. So, as Zoe said in the introduction, I'm now at the Natural History Museum in Berlin, but the work that I'm going to be talking to you about today was all done during my PhD at the University of Bristol. And of course, the theme of today's talk, it's all about electric ecology. And the basic idea of electric ecology is trying to understand the different ways that animals could actually use naturally occurring electricity to play an ecological role to help them in their lives, or sometimes it may hinder them. And we're going to kind of get into all of those things in a moment. But I think before we kind of dive into the biology, it is worth honoring my roots a little bit and just kind of giving a quick crash course in what I mean by electricity, because I think, you know, when we think of electricity, we're all aware of it, but we often think of human sources of electricity. We think of power lines, or we think of the plug sockets in our homes. But of course, electricity is a fundamental part of the universe, and it actually occurs basically everywhere in the universe. It's the reason the universe exists. So when we talk about electricity, what we're really talking about is the interaction between electrically charged objects. So this is things like electrons and protons. And most importantly for my talk today is the fact that this kind of electrostatic charge can accumulate in air through friction. And we know this as static electricity. You would have been exposed to this when you rub a balloon on your head and it charges your hair up and your hair moves around. Or if you've got like a static shock on a trampoline from wearing socks. It's something that we're all very aware of. And the reason that we're aware of it is because it can exert forces. And sometimes those forces are painful, as I just mentioned. But kind of looking at it from the ecologist's point of view, this fact that they can exert forces where charged objects can interact with each other, it's very interesting, because if something can exert a force, it points to the fact that this thing could also play an ecological role. Could animals use these forces or be hindered by these forces? So now we move on to the biological realm. As I mentioned, objects can build up charge through friction, and the same is true of animals that are living in the terrestrial environment surrounded by air. You can see some rather extreme examples here, but it's not just limited to kind of artificial materials like this polystyrene. We also generally see that many animals will accumulate static charge naturally in their natural lives as they, say, rub up against leaves or sand, or even as they fly through the air. They build up this static charge through friction, and therefore it really poses this question of whether static electricity could play an ecological role because these animals may be able to have things attracted onto them or repelled away from them, or otherwise feel this static electricity in some way. And this was basically the whole idea of my thesis, and it's going to be the journey that I try to take you on today during this talk. And I'd like to think if we combine the physics and the biology in this way, both Albert and Charles here would agree with me that yes, it could play static electricity could play an ecological role. It's also important for me to note that actually neither Einstein or Darwin said anything really about this, but it does make me look much smarter if I put them on the slides, so that's why they're there. But to answer this question, I wanted to look at a variety of different ecologies that could potentially be affected or influenced by static electricity. And I tried to pick the three most important ecological interactions that I could think of in the modern world. And at least by my judgment, these were pollination, parasitism, and predator-prey interactions. And I promise you, I didn't just pick them because it's alliteration. I do think that these are the most important ones, and hopefully you'll agree with me by the end of this talk. But let's start off with pollination. So for this study on pollination, we chose to focus on butterflies and moths because they're very, very important but underappreciated pollinators. But before I dive into the specifics of butterflies and moths and static electricity, it's probably important that I first explain how we actually find out how much static charge an animal carries. And the way that we do this, there's a few different ways, but the way that I ended up doing this was using this device here, which you can see very neatly organized in the field. But this is basically a little device called a picoammeter. And what a picoammeter does is it detects really, really tiny electrical currents. And you can basically detect these tiny electrical currents and then amplify them up into a big voltage that you can then record on a computer. And the really nice thing about this is it means that whenever a charged object passes through, say, a ring-shaped sensor like you can see here, you will get an impulse through your picoammeter that looks like this top right-hand graph here. And this is really informative because basically, if you measure the area underneath this curve, that amount of voltage is proportional to the amount of charge that that object was carrying as it passed through the loop. And the direction that it travels in first, so whether it goes up first or down first, tells you whether it was positively charged or negatively charged. So throughout this talk, I'm going to be telling you the various different charges that I measured on different animals. All you really need to know is that I somehow managed to convince that animal to pass through one of these loops. And I think the video already finished playing, but you could see, hopefully it showed up on the Zoom call for you that these bees were passing through this loop. So we mounted it at the edge of the nest. I'm just going to spoil it for you now. That was one of the easiest animals to measure the charge of. There are some others where I had to be quite creative. And if you'd like to know more details on that, you can definitely ask me questions at the end about how I did that for some of the more difficult animals. But yes, so back to the wonderful butterflies and moths. As I said, these are really, really important pollinators. There's many species of flower that only are pollinated by butterflies and moths. So they're completely dependent on these as pollinators. But sometimes they kind of get a bit forgotten because everyone's very bee focused, which is great. Bees are also wonderful. But often the butterflies and moths, they get forgotten in this context. So the idea here that we were really wondering is, could a pollinating insect like a butterfly or a moth accumulate so much static charge that pollen is actually attracted onto them, making them better pollinators? So to begin with, we measured a whole load of different species of butterfly and moth from a whole load of different families. They also play different ecological roles. Some of them are diurnal, some of them are nocturnal. Because we wanted to get a good idea of whether butterflies and moths would generally carry electrostatic charge, and also why they might carry or not carry electrostatic charge. And every single individual we measured did carry some amount of electrostatic charge. And as you can see, though, it varies quite a lot between different species. And I'll get onto that in a bit more detail in a second, but more focusing on the ecological role for now. the consequence of this big electrostatic charge on the butterfly or on the moth is that as they approach a flower, a very, very strong electric field is formed. And this electric field literally pulls pollen from the flower's sexual organs onto the butterfly or moth. And this is going to make them better pollinators because more pollen will land on them. But it also means they don't even actually need to make contact with the flower in order to pollinate it, which is super, super exciting. And it kind of changes a lot of our conceptions about what the requirements are for an insect to be a pollinator or be a good pollinator. So this is obviously very, very beneficial for the flowers. And you actually see that there may even be some adaptations of the flower to take even greater advantage of this. So as well as the pollen being attracted, like you can see in this animation on the right-hand side here, we also see that the sexual organs that are carrying some of the pollen on the flowers are also attracted. So I'm bringing in a charged ball here that's charged to the same charge as a butterfly or a moth. And hopefully you saw that the sexual organ literally rotated round towards the charge. And this is exactly what would happen when a charged insect like a butterfly or moth approaches it too. Which I think is super exciting, and it kind of adds this super new dimension to pollination ecology. But I also, as I mentioned earlier, want to talk about the fact that there's variations between different species of butterfly and moth. And the interesting thing is that these variations actually correlate with a few traits that these species of butterfly and moth have. So the most obvious and the most boring one is body size. This is kind of to be expected, that basically as a butterfly or moth gets larger, it can carry more charge because it's bigger and it has a larger surface area. So there's more surface area for friction to continue to charge them up. But I think more interestingly than that, we actually see that there's correlations with the biogeography of these species. So basically, whether these species were native to a temperate or a tropical environment affected how charged they would become. And this is independent of the climatic conditions in which they were measured. So it's not simply that it's harder to become charged in the tropics because it's more humid. Actually, if you measure these species in the same conditions, you generally find that tropical species have lower charges, and they're also much more likely to be negatively charged, which is interesting because the vast majority of the species we measured were positively charged. And this is a trend that we generally see across most animals, that positive charges are much more common than negative charges. But in this case, that's not the case for these tropical species of butterfly and moth. We see that they're much more likely to be negatively charged. And we also see a difference based on the ecology of the animal. So not all butterflies and moths actually feed as adults. So many of them don't even visit flowers at all. And of course, some are nocturnal and some are diurnal. If you think of the butterflies, day active, most moths, night active. And we also see a correlation with these ecologies and the amount of charge that these insects are carrying. So basically, what we see is that the species of moth that visit flowers at night are much more likely to be negatively charged than their counterparts that visit flowers during the day or that are nocturnal but don't visit flowers. And all of these things are kind of interesting, but it's not necessarily intuitive as to why we would see these correlations. And the truth is, we certainly don't know this for a fact, but one thing that it could point to is the fact that actually this electrostatic charge might be a trait, like it might be a property that these species have that can actually be passed on from generation to generation, i.e., it's a trait that's evolved because it has some kind of adaptive quality that it actually is advantageous for example, tropical species and also species that visit flowers at night to have a low or very weird negative charge. And there's many reasons that we can imagine that this could be the case. One idea that we have is that if you are an insect, one of the most dangerous things that you can do is live in the tropics. I don't know if any of you have been to the tropics. I'm sure some of you have. For those of you that haven't, there's a lot more predators there than there are in temperate regions like in Europe. So the predation pressure on insects is much, much higher in the tropics than it is in temperate regions. And this is also true that one of the probably second most dangerous thing you can do as an insect is visit a flower at night, because a lot of predators like to wait on flowers to ambush insects that are trying to visit them. If you ever think of like crab spiders that sit on flowers and they'll grab bees as they approach, same thing happens to butterflies and moths. And of course, it's even more dangerous at night because it makes it harder to spot your predators as you're approaching a flower. So one idea we have is that perhaps if predators could actually sense the static electricity that is coming off of a butterfly or moth, then it may be advantageous for those butterflies or moths to reduce their charge or to have a weird charge, like a negative charge, because that might confuse predators that are waiting for them in the tropics on flowers to ambush them. Of course, we don't know for a fact that this is definitely why these traits correlate so nicely with the electrostatic charge, but this is just a hypothesis that we have. And I think it's a really exciting one because it's the first time that we have evidence to suggest that the amount of charge that an animal can accumulate is a hereditable trait and may have advantages or disadvantages in different ecological contexts. But that's it for pollination for now. The next ecological context that I worked on was parasitism. And for parasitism, we chose to focus on this disgusting creature that you can see on the screen here. This is a tick. Specifically, this is Ixodes ricinus, which is the most common species of tick in the UK. It's also the tick that carries a lot of the diseases that infect livestock, but also our pets, and most notably us. So if you've ever got Lyme disease in the UK, or you know someone that has, chances are they got Lyme disease from this tick. So they're very, very important to us in terms of the kind of economic costs they have, the social costs they have, the medical costs they have. It's quite important for us to understand how they're actually finding their hosts, like the animals that they choose to parasitize, like cows, like rabbits, like dogs, and like us. Because if we can understand this process, we may also be able to develop preventative measures to stop them from being able to latch onto us and our loved ones and our pets and our farmyard animals and give us diseases. So basically, it made sense to work on these because also they're quite small, and it does kind of make you wonder whether they could, in the same way that the pollen is attracted from a flower onto a butterfly, could electrostatics attract a tick onto its host, like a cow, like a rabbit, like a dog, or a human? And the way that we chose to go about this was to initially basically figure out how strong the electrostatic force coming off of a typical tick host is. So for this, we took a cow as an example. And here you can see I'm basically modeling this electric field strength around the cow. And this tells us that actually quite strong electric fields come off of these animals. Again, they're building up charge through, we think, friction. So as a cow is kind of walking around, brushing up against trees, against the grass, also in the wind, we think that they're building up this static electric charge. And this also leads to very strong electric fields coming off of them, which could potentially attract ticks. But next, we needed to actually check that electric fields of this strength are strong enough to attract something like a tick. Because, you know, I said ticks are small, but they're much bigger than pollen. So it wasn't clear whether this is something that would happen. So in this video that I'm about to play for you, which hopefully the frame rate stays high enough for you all, we have a tick walking along. And then I'm going to bring in again a charged nylon ball. And this ball has been charged to the same kind of charge that we would expect on a typical host of a tick. And you can see that as the charge comes in, the tick very rapidly gets launched upwards onto the charged object. And we see this also when we literally use animal fur. So this is actually a rabbit foot. As a side note, disturbingly, you can buy like 4 kilogram bags of rabbit feet on Amazon. And as I said, I was living in Bristol at the time, and it actually arrived the same day, which I don't know how I feel about the fact that this is probably still in my search history somewhere. I assume I'm now on some kind of watch list. But it was very useful because it meant that I could also see if the ticks are attracted to the charge that is actually on mammal fur, for example, with this rabbit foot. So there's actually a tick positioned at the end of these forceps that I'm holding. And then you'll see in slow motion, I'll release the tick and it gets pulled horizontally against gravity onto the rabbit fur. And this is over a distance of quite a few millimeters, which might not sound like much, but that's actually multiple body lengths of the tick. It's kind of like us being pulled across like 6 stories of an apartment complex. It's like, for them, it's a really big distance. And the important thing as well to note is that ticks are actually incapable of jumping. So without this electrostatic force to attract them, they have no way of reaching a host that doesn't directly make contact with them. And so by using static electricity, it's going to massively increase, well, we don't know for a fact that it massively increases how often they're able to attach onto hosts. But you'll see from the rest of this talk, there's a fairly strong indication that it could really be a really beneficial mechanism for them to basically effectively increase their reach. Because in some cases, you see attraction over absolutely crazy distances. So in this video here, we have a little bit of perspex, and this has also been charged up to the same amount of charge that we would expect on a typical tick host, like a rabbit or a cow. And again, I have a tick at the end of the forceps, and you'll see that when I release the tick, it launches several centimeters across onto the charge. And so this all points to the fact that, yeah, ticks are going to be attracted by the static electricity of their hosts. But we wanted to obviously describe this a bit more formally than some fun high-speed videos that I did in the lab. And so for this, we created a setup where we have a electrode where we can basically put whatever voltage we like onto it. So we can basically really finely control the amount of charge on the electrode. And then we can place a tick underneath, and we can vary the height of the electrode. We can vary the charge on the electrode and see how that affects the attraction of these ticks. So to begin with, we just put, again, the same kind of charge that we would expect to be on a typical tick host. And you can see if you look at figure B here, that they were only ever attracted onto the electrode when the electric field is on, which, yeah, it would be very weird if they were attracted without it. But, you know, this is science. You have to test these things just to check that there's not something else weird going on. So they are almost certainly being attracted in nature by the kinds of electric fields that are coming off of their hosts. And this process happens quite quickly. So if you look at figure C, we saw that the average time that it took for these ticks to be attracted was within 1 second of the electric field being switched on. So they can very quickly be attracted onto their hosts. So the cow or the rabbit doesn't need to stick around very long for this to be able to happen. But we wanted to dive in more and actually try to properly figure out what the threshold for this attraction is. And the way that we did this was by varying the distance of that electrode and then gradually increasing the amount of charge on it until we got an attraction. And if you do this for a certain number of ticks at a certain distance, you can then plot it in a nice plot that you see on the left here, and you can draw a straight line through it, and this tells you distance by voltage. And the gradient of that line literally tells you the electric field strength. So basically, no matter what the charge is on the animal or no matter what the distance is, you can always calculate the charge or the distance that would be needed for each. And the really interesting thing we see here is that when we calculate the threshold electric field strength required, we see that it basically almost perfectly corresponds to the strength of electric field that we would expect to occur between a blade of grass, which is where ticks love to sit and wait for their hosts to come along, and a typically charged host. So this really points to the fact that it's very likely that this is something that's occurring in nature and increases the efficiency of these ticks to attach onto their hosts. Now, here's where it gets very weird. For those of you that can remember your last physics lesson, whether it was at university or at GCSE or before then, you might hopefully remember that generally the way that electrostatic attraction works is that opposites attract and the same charges are repelled. So if you have a positive charge and a negative charge, they will be attracted together. But if you have two positive charges or two negative charges, they'll actually be repelled from each other. So you would expect that the ticks would only be preferentially attracted to whichever hosts have the opposite charge to themselves. So we wanted to test this actually as a way of finding out what the typical charge of a tick is. But we found something very weird. We found that they're equally attracted to both negative and positive charges, which is weird. But there's a very, very good explanation for this. So as I mentioned, we would expect that if a tick, for example, had a positive charge, like you can see here, and a cow had a negative charge, that these two would be nicely attracted to each other. That's perfect for the tick, not so perfect for the cow. But if the tick had a positive charge and the cow had a positive charge, or they both had negative charges, we would actually see that the tick is repelled away. Not very useful for the tick. But as I saw in the data that I just showed you, we don't see that. We always see an attraction, whether the cow is positively charged or negatively charged. And what this tells us is that the mechanism of attraction, it's not about the tick actually having any charge, any net charge at all. The mechanism is actually inductive. And what this means is, basically, any material essentially on Earth and most of the universe has charged particles in it. We have them right now. We've got electrons flowing around in us. We've got the protons in our atoms. We have positive and negative charges within us, as does nearly any material you think of. Yeah, the screen that you're watching on also has them on, but your wooden floor or your window, all of these things will have charges within them. It's just one of the fundamental particles that we find in the universe. But typically, those charges cancel each other out. So most objects, if they don't carry like a net charge, will have an equal number of positive charges and negative charges. And so they don't experience any attraction to other charged objects because they have all of their positive charges. For example, if you had a negative cow, all of the positive charges would be repelled, but all of the negative charges would be repelled from the negative charge of the cow. All of the positive charges would be attracted, but those two forces cancel each other out. However, if the charges can move within the object, this is no longer the case. So, given the example of a negatively charged cow, here we have a tick that has no net charge, okay? But it does contain these charged particles like electrons, like protons. If the negatively charged cow comes near to the tick, the negative charges within the tick will be repelled and the positive charges will be attracted. And you get a charge separation within the tick. Now, the positive charges are closer to the cow than the negative charges are. And what this means is that the attractive force experienced by the positive charges is now greater than the repulsive force experienced by the negative charges because the positive charges are now closer to the cow. And so the result of that is that overall there's a greater attractive force than a repulsive force, and the tick is attracted onto the cow. And the same is true if you have a positively charged cow. So here we have our positively charged cow. We have our tick over here with all of its equal number of positive and negative charges sitting within it. When the cow comes nearby, the positive charges in the tick are repelled away from it. The negative charges are attracted towards it. Now there's a difference in the distance of the negative and positive charges, and attraction wins again. So this is incredibly beneficial for the ticks because it means that it doesn't actually matter which polarity of charge their hosts have. They will always be attracted. So they're not specific to a certain kind of animal that charges in a certain kind of way. They should pretty generally be attracted to most hosts. And that's obviously going to increase their efficiency at finding hosts to feed from. Okay, we're now on to our final ecological context. And in my personal opinion, this is probably the most important ecological context on Earth. And the reason I believe that this is the case is that predator-prey interactions basically apply to nearly every animal that now exists. If you think about it, nearly any animal is eaten by another animal or eats another animal or both. And so these are really strong drivers of natural selection in nature. And also one of the main reasons we see species of animals evolving certain abilities or traits is either to make them better at avoiding their predators or better at catching their prey. And so to begin with, we wanted to focus on this predator here. This is the common wasp, the one that bothers you in the summer and flies into your beer at the pub, Vespula vulgaris. And these wasps actually consume caterpillars, which we'll see in a second. But I think before we dive more specifically into the ecology of these insects, it's worth going back to that slide that I showed you earlier on, where I made this point about exerting forces. Static electricity exerts forces. And earlier on, I told you that as an ecologist, this makes you wonder whether electrostatic forces could play an ecological role. Static electricity could play an ecological role because it can exert forces on different objects in the environment. And now you've seen that that applies to things like pollen and to things like ticks. But the other thing that comes to mind when you think about something being able to exert a force in nature is whether it could be used as a sensory cue. If you think about it, most animals have managed to exploit nearly every kind of force-making quantity that exists on Earth. We have vision, obviously, where we can see light. We can hear the vibrations of air. We can we can't, but many animals can sense the magnetic field of the Earth. So anything that exerts a force has the potential to be a sensory cue because it could activate some kind of sensor. And I believe the same could definitely be true of static electricity. If static electricity can push and pull on pollen and ticks, why can't it also push and pull on some kind of sensor? And hopefully, if Albert and Charles were still with us, they would also agree with me on this point that the answer is yes. And there's actually some precedence to this. So this kind of electrostatic force or electrostatic sensing was first discovered about 10 years ago in bumblebees. And in bumblebees, it was shown that they can actually detect this static electric field that's coming off of flowers. And the reason that this is useful for them is that when a flower has been recently visited, it will actually have a reduced electrostatic charge. So by being able to sense the electric field around a flower, the bees can basically know, this flower has recently been visited. It's probably not going to have as much nectar. I'm not interested. And the same thing has been shown for hoverflies, so they can also detect these floral electric fields. But it's also been shown in a couple of other different species, a couple of other different contexts. So honeybees, they perform this thing called the waggle dance, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. For those of you who aren't, the waggle dance is this really amazing kind of secret language that honeybees use to communicate to each other where different resources are. So a bee will fly out, find a nice patch of flowers, come back, and it will literally start dancing within the hive. And the other bees can pay attention to this dance and learn from that bee where to go and find the nice patch of flowers. And it turns out if you take away all of the other sensory cues involved in this dance, so the vibrations of the air, or also vision, if the hive is exposed to the outside, they can see the honeybee dancing. If you get rid of all of these other sensory cues, actually the honeybees can sense and learn this information just from the static charge of the dancing bee oscillating backwards and forwards, which in my opinion is also really, really cool. And the last example that was discovered kind of before I delved into this electrostatic sense was in spiders. So quite horrifyingly to some, spiders can technically fly. And they don't have wings, but they do it using their silk. And they do this to disperse over large distances. So this behavior is called ballooning. And basically what the spider does is it lets out a strand of silk, and that silk then pulls it up into the atmosphere like a hot air balloon and lets it drift away. It turns out that these spiders can actually be attracted upwards just by the electric field that is in the atmosphere. So there's always an electric field in the atmosphere. When this gets really extreme, that turns into things like thunderstorms, right? But it actually exists all the time. If you go outside on a sunny day, there's actually an electric field in the air, and it's way higher than you might think it is. So in fair weather conditions, it's about 100 volts per meter. So what that means is if you're a fairly tall human, that the air around your head is about 200 volts higher than the air around your feet, which is obviously the kind of voltage that we get out of our mains electricity plugs in the UK. So it's actually quite considerable. And it turns out that this quite considerable atmospheric electric field can actually pull these spiders up into the air. But not only that, they can detect how strong the electric field in the air is, and then use that to decide on when to try to balloon, because you want to try to balloon when the electric field is strongest so that you're pulled up as much as possible. And the last thing that's kind of worth mentioning in relation to this is that in all of these cases, the mechanism that has been identified for this sense is electrostatic deflection of mechanosensory structures, which, to put it in plain terms, means these animals are hairy, okay? And when a charged object like a bee or a flower or the atmosphere comes near to an animal, or the animal comes near to it, the hairs on that animal will literally be deflected in exactly the same way as when you rub a balloon on your head. You can then push the hair around on your head just using the charge without them touching. The exact same thing is happening to the bees and the hoverflies and the spiders. So their little hairs are being pushed around by the static electricity, which is very, very exciting because almost all animals in the terrestrial environment have hair. So it kind of points to the fact that maybe most animals actually have this electrostatic sense, and we've just never realized. But one potential criticism of making that assumption that, static electricity could be a widespread sensory cue is that these examples that I've given here are quite specific. So there's not many species of animal that visit flowers. There's only one or two species that do the waggle dance, and equally, not many species of animal can disperse by ballooning. And so this makes it hard to make the argument that this electrostatic sense could be widespread because we need a more generic ecological context that applies to most animals. And then if we can find that electrostatic sense in that ecological context, we will be able to say with a lot more confidence that actually electrostatic sensing could very well be a very widespread sense in nature. And that brings us back to the predator-prey interactions. As I said, these are pretty ubiquitous in the natural world. Like nearly every animal is either eaten by another animal, eats another animal, or both. So if we can see that static electricity is a sensory cue in this ecological interaction, it really, really points to the possibility of the electrostatic sense being a super common thing in nature, just like vision is, just like hearing is. So as I said, to do this, we focused on wasps and also the caterpillars that they consume. So it was these three species of caterpillar here. These are all native to the UK. And most of them we collected from the wild. And you'll be pleased to know that once I was finished experimenting on them, I raised them into butterflies and then released them back, which was a very fun thing, although I think people thought I was part of a wedding party or something. But yeah, as you may have got the sense for now, the first step when kind of conducting these kinds of studies is to measure the charges involved. How charged is a wasp? How charged is a caterpillar? Turns out they also accumulate charge, and then we can model the electric field that would exist between them when they interact. And again, we find that there's a strong electric field that occurs between a typically charged wasp and a typically charged caterpillar, which you can see in the bottom panel here. And now that we have that electric field strength, we can actually expose caterpillars to this electric field strength and see if they respond to it. And this is exactly what we did. And we did this in a few different ways. So for some species, they have this really nice kind of coiling defensive behavior. And it makes it really obvious that they perceive a threat. So you can see this for the cinnabar moth and the scarce vaporer moth in the top two panels. For those ones, we basically pick the caterpillars up, we put them underneath an electrode that's emitting a wasp mimicking electric field, and then we timed how long it took them to uncoil and also how long it took them to start walking, because these are both great indicators of how much threat they perceive they are under. Now, this bottom species, the peacock butterfly, the caterpillars are much braver. They don't coil up, they fight. So they like to defend themselves by biting and also flailing around with their big spiky bodies. So for them, we just also exposed them to an electric field as they climbed a pole. And we looked at how long they spent flailing and also whether they tried to bite the source of the electric field. And across all of these species and all of these ecological, so all of these behavioral setups, we found that they spend significantly longer doing defensive behaviors like coiling, like freezing, like flailing, but also that they exclusively tried to bite the electrode when it was emitting a wasp mimicking electric field. And they never tried to do this when it wasn't emitting the electric field. So this behavioral evidence points really strongly to the fact that these animals are able to sense the electrostatic charge of their predators and also perceive that electrostatic charge as an indicator that a threat is nearby, which is super, super exciting. And as I said, it kind of points to the fact that this electrostatic sense could be quite widespread. But we also wanted to check how they're detecting it. As I mentioned earlier, in bees and hoverflies and spiders, it's mechanosensory hairs that have been implicated, so literally deflection of a hair. And we also find that these caterpillars are very hairy and they're covered in loads of candidate electroreceptors. So to test them for their sensitivity to electric fields, what we did was we put them under a really fancy bit of equipment called a laser Doppler vibrometer. And basically what this thing does is it's a laser that you can point to a structure and it can detect really tiny vibrations of that structure. So we played the wing beat frequency of a wasp, which is about 180 wing beats per second, as an electrical signal. And then we measured whether the hairs were moving. And they do move. So this tells you that these hairs will be able to detect that kind of static electric trace of the wasp. But the really weird thing is that they don't actually move at the frequency of the wasp's wing beat, they move at the second harmonic, which is basically is double the frequency. So in this case, we played a 180 hertz electrical signal, but they're responding at 360 hertz. And this again tells us something really interesting about the mechanism, which is exactly the same as the mechanism of attraction we saw in the ticks, where rather than relying on carrying their own static electric charge, they just have charges within their hairs, and these get separated in the same way that they got separated in the tick and caused attraction. The same thing is happening to the hairs, which has two really cool consequences. One, it means that they can tell the difference between their hair being pushed around by the airflow from the wing beat and the hair being pushed around by the static electricity of the wing beat, which means that if one sensory modality is a bit more reliable than the other, they can prioritize that one. It also tells us that the caterpillars themselves don't need to carry any electrostatic charge in order to be electrosensitive, which is really, really exciting because it essentially means that caterpillars are electrostatically camouflaged. So if the wasp can also detect static electricity, it can't detect the caterpillar because it doesn't carry any significant charge, but the caterpillar can detect the wasp. So there's an advantage for the caterpillar. And at the moment, at this snapshot of evolutionary history that we find ourselves in, the caterpillars are winning that evolutionary arms race between prey and predator. But we also wanted to look at the actual sensitivity of these hairs and see whether they could be specifically tuned to the wing beats of their predators. So to do this, we basically we played a whole series of frequencies from 0 to 5,000 hertz, and we looked at when the hair moves the most. And you get this really broad resonance between about 100 and 700 hertz, which is super interesting because that's exactly the range of frequencies that insects flap their wings at. So it basically points to the fact that these hairs are electromechanically tuned to the wing beats of their predators. So they're basically hypersensitive specifically to that kind of electric signal, which I also think is super, super exciting. But this raises one last question. And that question is whether there could be specialists of this electrostatic sense. In the same way that a bird of prey has the most acute vision, bats have incredible hearing, and dogs have basically the best sense of smell on the planet, could there be a super electrostatic sensor out there? And I think a really great candidate for this question is these amazing creatures. They're called tree hoppers. And they come in all of these crazy different shapes and sizes and colors, most importantly, shapes, but no one really knows exactly why. And this is especially strange because the group of bugs that they evolved from within are actually rather boring. So it's not completely obvious where all of this diversity has come from and why, especially because many of the shapes are not intuitive. Some of them look like thorns, and you can be like, okay, they're trying to protect themselves by being spiky or camouflaged as a horn. But some of these structures are just ridiculous, and there's no obvious perception for us as to why they are the way that they are. But as you can imagine, because I'm talking about it, I do have some ideas on this. Now, unfortunately, there's only two species of tree hopper that live in the UK, and they're both very boring. So despite this general diversity that the tree hoppers have, the ones in the UK, not super interesting. So it meant that unfortunately, someone had to make the sacrifice, i.e. me, of going to Costa Rica, which is a country where we see an amazing diversity of tree hoppers, to find these animals in the wild and investigate this electrostatic question a bit further. So we specifically focused on this species here, which is Poppaea capricornis. And as you can see, it's got this really crazy like trident structure coming out the back and also two horns coming out of the front. And it's really not obvious why you would want this structure. Like it doesn't really have a very intuitive, adaptive function, at least in my opinion. But when we test these animals for electrostatic sensitivity in a similar way that we did for the caterpillars. So we got the tree hopper to climb up the pole. We basically just looked at whether they would retreat away from the pole when an electric field was on, and we compared it to when the electric field was off, and we find that they're much more likely to retreat when we're playing a predator mimicking electric field. So like the caterpillars, these tree hoppers are also electrostatically sensitive. But the real question that I was posing is not just whether they can sense electricity, but do these crazy structures actually make them better at it? And when we look into the physics of it, it definitely looks like that could be the case. So if we model the electric field between a typically charged tree hopper and a typically charged wasp, we see that incredibly strong electric fields are set up around these extreme structures that they have. And the reason for this is very similar to the reason why a tree in an open field gets struck by lightning first. Basically, the electric field wants to follow the path of least resistance, and that's often these really spiky structures coming out of the tree hopper. So you can kind of view this as the tree hopper's crazy structures acting kind of analogous to like a lens, but for electrostatics. And it's going to increase their sensitivity to the electrostatic signal of, for example, their predators. And we did a similar thing with the laser Doppler vibrometer, where again, tree hoppers, very hairy animals. These crazy structures are covered in different hairs. We played an electric field mimicking the wind beat frequency of their wasp, and we see that the hairs are indeed vibrating at that frequency. So it also looks like they're using mechanosensory hairs for detecting static electricity. Now, these are some really horrible mathematical plots that I'm not going to go into the like really, really horrendous details of. But basically, to understand these, all you need to really get is that the lines that are different colors correspond to different quantities of charge. But more importantly, the lines that are dashed are an opposite charge to the lines with a solid coloration. So basically, one means positively charged wasp, the other one means negatively charged wasp. And what these plots are is their sensitivity windows. So it basically tells you the range at which a particular hair would start responding to the electric field of a predator. And there's two different kinds of hairs that these tree hoppers have. So they have normal ones that kind of just stick up out of their body. And we see with these that basically they move whether the predator is negatively or positively charged. It just changes the direction that they move in. But they also have these weird hairs that are found in pits. So it's like a dome, like a half dome, and then the hair extends across that pit. And no one really knows what the function of these hairs is. Lots of insects have them, but it turns out that they have a really beautiful function in the context of electrostatic sensing, which is that they only respond to one polarity of charge. So a particular hair will only respond to a positive charge or a negative charge, but it will only respond to one of those. And what that means is that these animals can actually theoretically determine the polarity of charge that an animal is carrying, which you may be wondering, why would you need to do that? Why would you need to be really, really sensitive to the electric field by having these crazy structures, but also to the positiveness or the negativeness of the charge? Why would that be beneficial? Well, there's some clues from the ecology of tree hoppers. So I already mentioned that they're predated upon by many, many different species of insect, for example, wasps, but they also form mutualisms with ants and bees. So the bees will actually protect the tree hoppers from predators in exchange for being able to consume the honeydew. So this is basically a very polite way of saying the excrement of the tree hoppers. It's this really nice sugary liquid. I'm saying nice from the perspective of the bees, not from my personal perspective. But yeah, so they can they form these mutualisms where they're actually protected by bees. And the problem is, a bee and a wasp, roughly quite similar. And you don't want to be reacting defensively to your friends, to your mutualist bees, because if you for example, retreat away, the bee won't be able to protect you anymore. If you try to counterattack the bee, it's going to scare it off and it will no longer protect you. So maybe it would be advantageous for a tree hopper to be able to distinguish a predatory wasp from a friendly bee. And it turns out that mutualist bees and predatory wasps are actually electrically distinguishable from each other based on the properties of their charge. So we measured the charges of these animals in the ways that I described earlier. And we find that the predators, on average, had a much higher charge and were also much more likely to be negatively charged. So you can kind of view this as like basically predatory wasps are more electrically loud, and they also have a different electrical flavor. And ultimately, this means that there is sufficient electrical information for a tree hopper to be able to theoretically distinguish friend from foe. And what this all hopefully, if I've really pulled you down this rabbit hole with me now, starts to point to, if we go back to this crazy diversity that we see in the tree hoppers, what if these different structures, especially the ones that we really can't explain through other non-electrostatic means, what if they're differently tuned electroreceptors? What if each of these shapes makes them particularly sensitive to the certain kind of predator that they find in their environment, or the kind of mutualists that they find in their environment? What if it's basically a tuned electroreceptor? And some more evidence that points to this possibility is that we actually see remarkable convergent evolution in the weird shapes of these tree hoppers. So all of the species you see on the left are from the neotropics, and all of the species on the right are from the paleotropics. So these species have been separated by millions and millions and millions of years of evolution, and their most common ancestor looked like that boring tree hopper that I showed you from the UK earlier. And yet, weirdly similar morphologies have appeared in both sets of species, despite them living very, very far apart. But what's possible is that there's something similar about the electric ecologies that these animals find themselves in, and therefore they've converged on similar solutions to having an especially tuned electroreceptor. This is at this point, this is quite like speculative, but I certainly think that it's an exciting like avenue that we're continuing to work on, and I hope that many other people explore this possibility, because I do think that electrostatic sensing might actually explain a lot of these cases where we have this, really bewildering morphological diversity in different animals, are just weird shaped animals where we can't think of an explanation. I wonder if in a lot of them, if we looked at it through the perspective of electric ecology, that we might find a nice explanation for that. But yeah, with that, I'd like to conclude my talk. I hope you, while staring at this horrendous AI-generated image, for context, this is now how I hope you will see the world after being indoctrinated by my talk this evening. At the very least, I hope you walk away from this thinking about the ways that animals and plants can use static electricity to play an ecological role. And I hope that you've been convinced of the fact that actually it may be quite a ubiquitous force in nature. But beyond that, it could also be a sensory cue, and that many animals can actually detect static electricity. And if I've really pulled you with me, and this is a big stretch, I admit, that it could actually drive evolutionary adaptations and may actually be an explanation for some of the species that we see on planet Earth today. There was lots more examples of static electricity playing an ecological role that I didn't have time to talk about today. If you're really keen to get into the nitty-gritty of this, I have a review paper from a couple of years ago published in Biological Reviews. If you just search England and Robert 2022 Biological Reviews, it should come up. But with that, I'd just like to thank all of you for listening to me, and also all of the people that collaborated with me on this project, without which it wouldn't have been possible. all of the funders, all of the institutions. And yeah, I'm super happy to take any questions that you might have.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. What you might not be aware of right now is that the chat is going absolutely bananas with people saying what a fantastic presentation that was. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, thank you.
I think it's a really good thing that you couldn't see my face during that talk, because I tend to wear my emotions on my face quite a lot. So you would have seen me pulling all manner of shock, and, just like amazing. I really, really enjoyed it. And I know everybody else did. And I know there's a whole pile of questions. So I'm going to give Gavin just a couple of minutes more to pick through, because there's so many. We're not going to get to all of them. It's just not possible. And instead, I'm going to take this moment to be really super selfish and ask my question. So to take you right the way back to the beginning of your talk, which probably feels like a very long time ago now, you did say that some of the insects were more difficult to measure the charge of than others. And to ask you, I want to know which one was the most difficult, just for perhaps the good mental image that might come alongside that of you trying to measure these insects' charge.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, anything that like comes out of like a nest, like a hole, nice and easy. But that wasn't the majority of the animals, as you saw. To be honest, it was quite comical the way that I had to measure the charge of most of the butterflies and moths, because it's quite hard to get them to go in the direction that I want them to go, to pass through this quite small loop. So the solution I came up with was to tie fishing line around the butterfly and moth and basically fly them around on a leash. It was like taking a dog for a walk around the lab. This was also important to make sure that they had like an ecologically relevant charge that they would get from flying. But yeah, it was quite funny because the lab that I worked in back then had a big glass front that was essentially right next to the undergraduate library. And I think they used to just walk past me flying these moths around the lab, and they must have been probably questioning their decision to do a biology degree. I'm not sure. But yeah, the moths were pretty tricky in a lot of cases for sure.
That's just an amazing mental image, and I'm kind of sad that I didn't get to see it myself actually in real life. That I feel like I've missed out now. So hopefully that's given Gavin enough time to organise his thoughts, and hopefully he's still there and he's not had to run out of the room. So Gavin, I'm going to ask you to jump in.
Yep. Hi.
Brilliant.
I'll never organise my thoughts. It doesn't matter how much time you give me. But so obviously loads of questions and loads of compliments, of course. Great presenter. You've made really complex topic accessible, of course. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Really pertinent question asked by a couple of people, Helen, Wrigley, and Nat, both asked basically what made you think of this research, what got you into it.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to take all of the like credit for being like, of course, yeah, like I had this like eureka like moment like for it. To be honest, it was basically that I did a physics degree and then I realized I don't find like pure physics very fun. And what I did find really interesting was animals. And I was like, okay, well, how can these two things be combined together? So I was basically just looking around for kind of like avenues of research where there were PhD projects available, where I think I could bring something as a physicist where I would actually be of value. And yeah, Danielle Robert, my like supervisor, had a very like generically advertised project. Just I think I was originally supposed to be entirely working on bees, and then within a week he showed me some tree hoppers, and then we went a bit crazy from there, basically. So yeah, it was something that people had been working on a little bit before I came along, and I really just wanted to like take it and really like try to push it as much into the kind of like the mainstream like zeitgeist as possible by really spreading the like ecological diversity of the field, basically. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Did all those rabbit feet make you very lucky?
Well, I mean, I got nice results, so I guess so.
Yeah. There's quite a few questions around ticks, not surprisingly, and I suppose it boils down to, are there particular sort of practical applications at the moment of, things that would repel ticks, or indeed, should you avoid walking in fields with wellies on, for example?
So I'm going to preface everything I say here with the fact that for sure the best way to avoid getting ticks is to either not go to the places where ticks are or to wear chemical repellents. These things work. Please continue to use them. However, yes, there is feasibly some applications like of this finding in terms of, for example, if you could coat either our clothing or maybe even our livestock or our pets in basically anti-static sprays, it does have the potential to reduce the amount of tick infestations that we or these animals get. But again, to be very clear, probably the majority of times that a tick attaches onto a host, it's not using electrostatics. So most of the time, they'll probably actually make contact just by brushing up against the host. But what the mechanism that we've unveiled reveals is that in those cases where you have like a near miss, that the tick is still going to be able to attach. So I would maybe expect that if you did field experiments on this where you discharged certain people or certain animals, I do think that with a large enough sample size, you would see a significant reduction in the tick infestation of discharged people or animals. But I don't think that it's like significant enough that like people should be going out and like trying to discharge themselves. Or one consideration is that a lot of outdoor clothing is very statically charged, like the kind of like waterproof clothing that a lot of us wear, these artificial fibers, they really build up a lot of charge. It is possible with those that when you go through like a meadow of grass that you're kind of vacuuming up the ticks. But again, the best way to prevent getting a tick bite is to wear a chemical repellent.
Great. Thank you. Related to that, there's a good question. Africa Gomez asked, are ticks unique in behaving like this, or do all insects? What properties of tick cuticles allow this? And I guess that's kind of I was thinking that's quite a relevant question. Generally, do small insects essentially all live within this electrostatic realm, or are there particular adaptations of the cuticle? I mean, we went into that with the CT, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
is there
So
something special about ticks?
yeah, so this is like a really like great question, and it's actually one that we don't know the answer to yet. So whilst we have shown that these ticks can and will be attracted by the electric field of their hosts in nature, it's also possible that other similarly sized invertebrates would also be attracted. It just doesn't benefit them if they're not a parasite. What we need to do now is a big comparative study where we get a whole load of similarly sized animals and we see whether parasites like ticks are more easily attracted than, say, an aphid, which doesn't have much interest in latching onto a cow, for example. So yeah, it's a really amazing question. It is conceivable that there could be adaptations that parasites like ticks have. So, for example, they might have modified polarizability, basically that the charges more easily move around in them to allow them to be attracted more and more quickly. But we don't know if this is the case yet. So yeah, it's a really nice like open question to basically try to do this like big comparative study of different animals and see whether there could be something adaptive going on there.
We could skip on to pollinators. So there's a great question from Gabe Wayman, which was actually I was going to ask as well, which is essentially, if the pollen is sort of leaping onto the insect, how does it come off at the next flower? And I suppose
Yeah.
related to that, I was wondering, is it being attracted to the parts of the insect that are then in close proximity with the
Mhm.
the ant with sexual organs of the flower?
Yeah, so I didn't have time to kind of like go into the proper details of this, but essentially, even if the pollen attraction is only unidirectional, so if it only goes from the flower onto the pollinator, it's still going to increase their efficiency as pollinators because most likely that butterfly or moth will then make contact, like physical contact with a flower later on. So it's not like electrostatics is needed for the pollination to happen. It just means that they're going to attract more pollen. But when they then visit another flower, that can then be brushed off with physical contact. However, there is also evidence that actually the pollen basically equalizes to the charge of the insect. And then when it approaches a subsequent flower, it then has the opposite charge to the flower and is in fact attracted from the insect back onto the flower. So we do actually think that there is this bi-directional pollen transfer, which should increase the pollination efficiency of charged insects quite considerably, I would imagine.
Fantastic. Another great question from Africa Gomez related to this. So Justin, so if bumblebees and presumably other bees are using gathering pollen particularly to feed their young, rather than for sort of incidental pollination, do they have a similar charge and intensity, or is it different to butterflies and moths?
So the really interesting thing is that like bumblebees have some of the like highest charge density that we've measured on any animal. So it could point to the fact that because they really benefit from actually gathering the pollen, that there is more selective pressure on them to evolve traits that allow them to charge up loads. It would also increase their sensitivity to the electric field of the flower, because basically the stronger your electric field is, the more electricity you can feel. And so like, yeah, basically it would benefit bumblebees quite considerably to have a high charge. We actually looked at this a little bit with the butterflies and moths. So there's one species of butterfly, or there's one clade of butterflies that actually eats pollen. It's the only butterfly clade that does this. And we compared it to like a close relative that doesn't eat pollen. We didn't find any difference. But we weren't so like disheartened by that, because with the butterflies, they almost exclusively collect the pollen with their like tongue, essentially. They're not really picking pollen off of their wings. So maybe where we might see a difference in the charge of the like pollen-eating butterflies would be specifically in the charge of the tongue. And the really interesting thing is that when you look at the tongues of these pollen-eating butterflies, they have loads more bristles, and they also do this like combing behavior where they rub the tongue. And both of those things would probably increase the amount of charge that the tongue is carrying. So yeah, I just need to make one of those electrostatic sensors that's small enough for a butterfly tongue to pop through it, and then we'll hopefully know the answer to that. But yeah.
All right, they'll have to show us all that sensing. Um, if you've got time, another couple of questions about plants and pollinators. I really like this question from Sue Taylor, which is basically, what about flowers with only one pollinator, with the really specific relationships? Do they, is there any difference in sort of electrostatic potential there?
Yeah, I mean, so this is something that's, as is the case with basically all electric ecology, because it's a very like new field. There's so many like amazing like hypotheses and questions that like pop up where we really have no idea. What we do know is that the electric field of a flower is affected by its shape. So there is a potential for pollinators to be able to distinguish between different types of flower based on just the electric field coming off of it. And it could actually be that if there are flowers that very, very specifically only attract one pollinator, either that pollinator very specifically only likes that kind of electric field, or vice versa, that pollinators or insects that aren't going to be able to feed from that flower might avoid that particular electric field. So it could actually be kind of like an honest signal from the flower, basically telling the insects like, this is what I am. Don't visit me if you're not this insect, or do visit me if you are this insect species. So yeah, there's certainly a possibility for that, but we have no idea if that's the case.
Great, thanks. Continuing the theme of all the many, many research areas you could be working on. Regina asked, do carnivorous plants use or react to electrostatic charges in attracting prey as well as being pollinated?
Yeah, I've always wondered this, because the mechanism for example, like a Venus flytrap, the way that the trap closes, it's actually electricity within the plant. And it's really conceivable that that mechanism could be triggered by like a strong electric field arriving. And yeah, for ages I've wanted to like get hold of some carnivorous plants and see if we can trigger them using electricity. Also, like a really like plausible like idea, but yeah, again, we have no idea. There's so much to do.
Yeah, yeah. Sort of related to that, Richard Dawson just suggested, oil beetle larvae spring to mind as electrostatic hitches onto bees. I guess
Mm.
hitchhiking is another area in which this may play a role.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, thankfully this is one where I can say we do know, one of the rare instances. So there's a paper by a group different to ours that showed that nematodes can actually be attracted onto the charge of bumblebees, and this benefits them because some species of nematode worm will basically disperse by hitching onto bees in the same way that the oil beetle larvae do. And yeah, so it's been shown that actually, yeah, it also benefits these kind of hitchhiking animals as well.
Fantastic. If I could ask my own question, I was really curious. Obviously, with you're talking about spiders ballooning and the sort of tiny
Mm.
little things um, taking advantage of the sort of electric potential in the air. I was just wondering about all the time. Do you have any idea about the potential sort of hindrances or opportunities to these tiny little insects that are flying around, the sort of sub 1 millimeter parasitoid wasps and the tiniest flies? I mean, essentially, are they having a big electrostatic challenge in just moving about in the air?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's also very conceivable. I know of one study that someone randomly did in the 70s, where he showed that the wing beat frequency of micro moths, I think it was micro moths, it was definitely moths, but their wing beat will slow down when they're in a really strong electric field. And it might be that they're actually struggling to flap their wings in that stronger electric field. So it is possible that in certain like meteorological conditions that might also be happening, especially to small insects that are going to be affected by it. It might also mean, yeah, that these small insects just get accidentally attracted and sucked onto a plant or onto another animal that they don't want to. There's another study by another group that looked at whether it hinders the ability of whiteflies to launch off of plants. So basically, whether they're so attracted to the plants that it makes it really difficult for them to take off, and that might be why they decide to jump rather than just fly. Basically, if they can jump, they can get out of the electric field quickly to make it easier. It was a really interesting hypothesis, but I think that their data didn't actually support. They themselves concluded that is probably not significantly affecting the whiteflies, but yeah, it doesn't mean that it wouldn't be in other species. So
Fantastic. Thank you. Um, do you have time for any more questions,
yeah, of
Zoe?
course, yeah, I'm happy to.
Awesome. I'm just going to ask, I love this question from Gabe Wayman. I think this is a question about leaf hoppers, but are they able to generate a high enough static charge for them to be protective, i.e. taser their predators?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unlikely that that happens except in like very specific circumstances. And the reason for that is in order to get like a kind of painful discharge, you need one of you need to build up a charge and then you need to touch something that is like sufficiently big conductor that can actually take that charge. Like if you bring two like insulating materials that don't conduct electricity together, they can be really charged, but they won't discharge onto each other because they can't conduct that electricity. So in order to get that like static shock, that's when it like is discharging. And we don't really like see many instances where like an animal or like two animals would create that like path of like discharge. You could conceive of it, especially if it's, for example, like a terrestrial prey item, and an aquatic predator. So let's say you're an insect that like hovers over the surface of the water, and then your predator likes to like grab you from the water. You could conceive in that ecological interaction, there could actually be a discharge into the aquatic predator and it might deter them. Again, no idea if this happens, but it's like certainly a possibility, basically.
Fantastic. I'm having flashbacks to the Van de Graaff generator at school now.
Yeah.
Uh, there's a few questions about particular other groups of organisms and lots, but I guess this is probably a good opportunity to ask what's next? What's next on your radar?
I mean, so something I didn't get a chance to like talk about, maybe I can even launch back to that slide to make the point a bit more easily. But so when we looked at the sensitivity of the caterpillars, right? So where we were trying to understand what the like resonant frequency of their electrosensitive hairs is. I mentioned that they have a resonance between 100 and 700 hertz. But I also mentioned that they actually respond at double the frequency. So actually this is really what we're talking about is they're responding to 50 to 350 hertz. The reason that's relevant is that 50 and 60 hertz, which is within that window, is mains electricity frequency throughout the world. And the other thing is that the strength of electric fields that we put into the environment from things like power lines, from our electronic devices, are way higher. They're way stronger than these electric fields that I've been talking about that come naturally off of like animals and plants and the atmosphere. And so one really concerning thing is that these animals are probably really sensitive to the electricity that we're producing, and it may be interfering with this electrostatic sense. So if you're a caterpillar that's even within like maybe even a kilometer of a power line, there's a possibility you can actually detect the electricity coming off of that power line. And it may essentially make you way worse at detecting your predators because either it's just being completely drowned out or you habituate to electrical stimuli and you stop paying attention to it. So I think whilst there's loads more different like ecological interactions that we've mentioned probably at least a dozen of them now in this like question session, and I think like I'm super excited to see what other people like discover. Like the dream for me is that people go away from this talk and think about how it could play a role in like their study system or in like an animal that they're familiar with or a plant that they love, and we can really flesh out this electric ecology. But for me personally, I think the most urgent thing is understanding whether actually man-made electricity is a sensory pollutant, because this data that we see in front of us right now points really strongly to the fact that it could be having quite a negative effect on our wildlife. But there are ways of mitigating this. We can shield power lines, for example. So if it's discovered that the animals are being affected by this and it makes them more likely to be eaten by their predators, we can hopefully do something about it. So for me, that's kind of the priority now. I would really love to know, basically how we're messing this up, and if we are, how we can fix it.
Thank you so much. That's a fantastic note, I think, on which to end. Thank you. There's amazing answers to all these questions.
Oh, thank you.
I was going to jump in because we are bumping up against time. So sorry to anybody who didn't get their question answered. I feel like we've been spoilt rotten already from the contents of the talk.